Hello viewers, welcome to Study with Master Notes. How are you all? I think all of you are fine. Okay. So in previous video, I described the unit 7, reading the test. Okay. So you can go through my video for description box and like, share, subscribe my channel to get new video on MEG English of IGNO or any PG entrance examination or NET examination. Okay, so we will go to the unit 8 characterization, that is MEG 6 American literature, the Scarlet letters characterization. Okay, so we will go the objectives, then introduction, then Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth, Pearl, minor characters, letter sum of questions and suggested reading. So again I will describe what is the characterization in Scarlet letter. The Scarlet letters characterization is objectives, introduction, Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth, Pearl, minor characters, letter sum of questions and suggested reading. So come to the test. What is the objectives? Okay, what is the objective of the unit? Every unit has its own objectives. So in this unit 8, what is the main objective? Okay, so you can say or you can write in comment box so that I am very much happy for your response. Okay, so what is the objectives of this unit? Our objective in this unit is to give you an idea of the major characters Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth and Pearl. Okay, so here the main characters are major characters are Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth and Pearl. We would also give you some idea of the minor characters like Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham and Mistress Higgins. Okay, so who are the major characters and who are the minor characters? You can write me in the comment box so that I can read your response. Okay, you would also be able to appreciate the complex relationship between the major and the minor characters. Okay, so who are the major characters? That is the Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth and Pearl. Then minor characters are Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham and Mistress Higgins. Then come to introduction. Okay, since the Scarlet letter is more of a historical romance rather than a realistic novel. Okay, the Scarlet letter is more of a historical romance. Okay, the Scarlet letter contains most historical parameters. Okay, that is historical romance parameter rather than a realistic novel. So it is not a practical oriented novel or realistic novel. It is more about historical romance. The characters tend to be allegorical and symbolical. Okay, here the characters tend to be allegorical or symbolical. They assume something. Okay, so the character most tend to be allegorical and symbolical. There are various ways in which scholars have looked upon the characters in the book. Okay, there are various ways in which the scholars have looked upon the characters in the book. While Hester seems to stand for art reflected in her exquisite needlework. Okay, while Hester seems to stand for art reflected in her exquisite needlework. Okay, Dimmesdale stands for religion due to his dedicated work as a pastor in his parish. Okay, while Hester seems to stand for art reflected in her exquisite needlework, and Dimmesdale stands for religion due to his dedicated work as a pastor in his parish. Okay, so Hester seems to stand for art reflected in her exquisite needlework. Dimmesdale stands for religion due to his dedicated work as a pastor in his parish. While Chillingworth stands for science in his relentless search for herbs and medicines, and Pearl stands for nature that is radiant, lovable but beyond human control. Taken together, the major characters seem to represent art, religion, science and nature. From another angle, these characters seem to foreshadow the Freudian categories of mind, the ID, the ego and the superego. Okay, so from another angle, these characters seem to foreshadow the Freudian categories of mind, that is ID, the ego and superego. Okay, so taken together, the major characters seem to represent art, religion, science and nature. It is Paul who seems to stand for the ID, and with her wild impulsive nature is governed by the pleasure principle. Okay, so she always acts according to impulses rather than the conscious thought. You know, Freud said that the ID is the biological part of personality, the seat of instincts, and is not subject to any social regulation. While Paul stands for the ID, Hester stands for the ego that is operated largely by the reality principle. Hester is aware of her own self, her eros, and physical needs, but she is also aware of the pressures of external reality, that is the norms of Puritan community in mid 17th century New England. Okay, Hester is aware of her own self, her eros and physical needs, but she is also aware of the pressures of external reality, that is the norms of Puritan community in mid 17th century New England. She also serves as a bridge and link between Paul, the ID, and Dimmesdale, the superego. It is the priest who represents the social and moral dimension of personality and is always governed by the high ideals of society. Okay, so it is the priest who represents the social and she also serves as a bridge and link between Paul, ID, and Dimmesdale, the superego. So who is superego? Here the Hester is superego. Okay, so she also serves as a bridge and link between the Paul, the ID, and Dimmesdale, that is the superego. It is the priest who represents the social and moral dimension of personality and is always governed by the high ideals of society. Dimmesdale has a pronounced conscience and suffers from a terrible sense of guilt and anxiety due to the sin of adultery. Okay, it is the priest who represents the social and moral dimension of personality and is always governed by the high ideals of society. Okay, so Dimmesdale has a pronounced conscience and suffers from a terrible sense of guilt and anxiety due to the sin of adultery. Okay, so Dimmesdale has a pronounced conscience and suffers from a terrible sense of guilt and anxiety due to the sin of adultery. Okay, so Dimmesdale has a pronounced conscience and suffers from a terrible sense of guilt and anxiety due to the sin of adultery. It is the dominance of the superego in the priest and his awareness of the ID within him, his craving for Hester that gives an edge to the drama of sin and redemption that is unfolded so graphically. It is the dominance of the superego in the priest and his awareness of the ID within him, his craving for Hester that gives an edge to the drama of sin and redemption that is unfolded so graphically. Okay, so it is the dominance of superego in the priest and his awareness of the ID within him, his craving for Hester that gives an edge to the drama of sin and redemption that is unfolded so graphically. From another angle, Hester, Dimmesdale and Chillingworth seem to represent heart, soul and mind. As a sister of charity, Hester is full of compassion and always tries to help the poor and needy. Okay, as a sister of charity, Hester is full of compassion and always tries to help the poor and needy. From another angle, Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth seem to represent heart, soul and mind. The narrator makes it clear that Hester stands for heart, and as a result she is able to atone for her sin and is transformed into an able, non-serving humanity. Dimmesdale is a priest and seems to stand for the soul. He does care for the soul of others and he is also tormented by his conscience. His antagonist, Chillingworth, is, however, primarily governed by his mind. His cold, calculating mind, utterly divorced from his heart, stifles his noble impulses as a physician dedicated to the profession of healing. He is too cerebral to be a credible and acceptable human being. While Hester seems to stand for life instinct, that is eros, Chillingworth seems to stand for death wish, that is thanatos. Okay, you know, eros and thanatos are two other basic concepts postulated by Freud in the 20th century. That Hawthorne could foreshadow some of the key Freudian concepts is an indicator of his keen probing into the psyche of his major characters. The Scarlet Letter is not only a historical romance, it is a psychological romance as well. The narrative that is unfolded so graphically encompasses action as well as incisive probing into mental processes of major characters like Hester, Dimmesdale, Chillingworth and Pearl. While the major characters are multidimensional and complex, the minor characters are more simple and allegorical. Reverend Wilson and Governor Bellingham represent the head of the church and the head of the state of the New England. Their close collaboration makes it clear that the government at the time was a kind of theocracy. They also represent the hegemony of the church and the state in the utopia established by the Puritans, and the individual who in any way challenged the authority of the church and the state had to bear persecution. Okay, they also represent the hegemony of the church and the state in the utopia established by the Puritans. Individual who in way challenged the authority of the church and the state to had bear persecution. It is also to be kept in mind that while the major characters are portrayed as dynamic, they undergo a subtle transformation, the minor characters are more or less or static. While the major characters are portrayed as complex characters, the minor characters are rather flat and one-dimensional. To sum up, while the major characters act and interact to create a moving drama of sin and redemption, the minor characters locate the tale in mid-17th century New England. While the major characters soar into a world of romance and make-believe, the minor characters remind us of the historical context of the romance. As we have already told you, the imaginary and the actual are closely interwoven in the text, creating a sort of neutral territory. You may also bear in mind Mistress Higgins, who acts as an agent and emissary of devil. She is definitely an allegorical character who tries to tempt both Hester and Dimmesdale but does not succeed. Okay, she is definitely an allegorical character who tries to tempt both Hester and Dimmesdale but does not succeed. The narrator, who belongs to mid-19th century America, has rightly suggested that the dialogue between Mistress Higgins and Hester could be taken as a parable, that is, a confrontation between good and evil. Mistress Higgins is a product of Puritan utopia created by the earliest settlers in colonial Boston. You may be also bear in mind Mistress Higgins, who acts as the agent and emissary of the devil. She is definitely an allegorical character who tries to tempt both Hester and Dimmesdale but does not succeed. So Higgins also as a minor character is the mind Mistress Higgins act as the agent and emissary of the devil. She is definitely an allegorical character who tries to tempt both Hester and Dimmesdale but does not succeed. The narrator, who belongs to mid-19th century America, has rightly suggested that the dialogue between Mistress Higgins and Hester could be taken as a parable, that is, a confrontation between good and evil. Mistress Higgins is a product of Puritan utopia created by earlier settlers in colonial Boston. Then Hester, no feature in Hawthorne's romance of the 1850s of greater psychological and cultural interest than his remarkable heroines. There is no other female protagonist that dominates the narrative as much as Hester does. According to Luther S. Lutic, the problem of the Scarlet Letter is really the problem of how to interpret Hester. Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Romance of the Orient, page 165. It is Hester who is presented in the romance at the beginning, and it is also Hester who is in focus at the end of the tale. The narrator makes it clear at the beginning that she is not an ordinary woman in colonial Boston. She is dark, handsome, and a rich, voluptuous Oriental. When she comes out of her prison, moves towards the scaffold of the pillory, her Oriental beauty, dark eyes, and dark hair has a strange, esoteric appeal. Even the letter A that has been embroidered on her somber dress is designed in a flashy and flamboyant mode. Voluptuous Oriental. She is dark, handsome, and rich, voluptuous Oriental. When she comes out of the prison and moves towards the scaffold of the pillory, her Oriental beauty, dark eyes, dark hair has a strange, esoteric appeal. Even the letter A has been embroidered on her somber dress is designed in a flashy and flamboyant mode. Its flourish and singularity is a sort of curl towards the scaffold of the pillory. Her oriental beauty, dark eyes, dark hair, has a strange historic appeal. Even the letter A that has been embroidered on her somber dress is designed in a flashy and flamboyant mood. Its flourish and singularity is a sort of call, defiance and challenge to all pervasive grey and somber that marked the fashion of the grim Puritan men and women in the mid-17th century New England. Defiance and challenge to all pervasive grey and somber that marked the fashion of the grim Puritan men and women in the mid-17th century New England. There is something of Annie Hutchinson's non-conformity and radicalism as described in Block 1 in Hester's psychological makeup. Defiance and challenge to the all-pervasive grey and somber that marked the fashion of the grim Puritan and the women in mid-17th century New England. There is something of Annie Hutchinson's non-conformity of radicalism in Hester's psychological makeup. As a lonely woman in a hostile city in the New World, Hester submits to the punishment inflicted on her, but in subtle ways. She also subverts Puritan orthodoxy through her wild, colorful Scarlet letter. Okay, that all pervasive grey and somber that marked the fashion of the grim Puritan men and women in the mid-17th century New England. There is something of Annie Hutchinson's non-conformity and radicalism as described in Block 1 in Hester's psychological makeup. As a lonely woman in a hostile city in the New World, Hester submits the punishment inflicted on her built in a subtle way. She also subverts Puritan orthodoxy through her wild, colorful Scarlet letter. Her retreat from the market to the lonely cottage outside Boston marks a new phase in her life. Her retreat from the market to the lonely cottage outside Boston makes a new phase in her life. She is able to support herself and her daughter Pearl through her needlework. Okay. So, her retreat from the market to the lonely cottage outside Boston marks a new phase in her life. She is able to support herself and her daughter Pearl through her needlework. It is her aesthetic sense and her exquisite needlework that enables her to perform the duty of a single parent in a traditional male-dominated society. It is her aesthetic sense and her exquisite needlework that enables her to perform the duty of a single parent in a traditional male-dominated society. The narrator has drawn her attention to all the combative energy of her character, which enables her to serve the poor and the needy. Okay, the narrator has drawn her attention to all the combative energy of her character, which enables her to serve the poor and the needy. There is a subtle transformation in Hester and the community that has persecuted her as the fallen woman begins to look upon her as a sister of mercy. The Scarlet letter A, that in beginning appears to the community as a badge of sin and shame, later on appears as a symbol of her calling as a sister of mercy. It is also viewed by the Puritan community as able, so strong was Hester Prynne with a woman's strength. The letter A, the Scarlet letter to be precise, also becomes the cross on a nun's bosom. In keeping with her status as a sister of mercy, Hester's dark oriental beauty also undergoes a change. The narrator's comment on this change is revealing indeed. It was a sad transformation too, that her rich and luxuriant hair had been cut off or was so completely hidden by a cap that not a shining lock of it ever once gushed into the sunshine. While Hester is transferred from a sinful woman into the angelic sister of mercy, and from a dark, voluptuous oriental woman into a nun who deliberately suppresses her youth and beauty by capping her hair, there is another subtle transformation at work. While Hester is transferred from a sinful woman into an angelic sister of mercy, and from a dark, voluptuous oriental woman into a nun who deliberately surfaces her youth and beauty by capping her hair, there is another subtle transformation at work. The narrator of the tale makes it clear that much of the marble coldness of Hester's impression was to be attributed to the circumstances that her life had turned in a great measure from passion and feeling to thought. Okay. The narrator of the tale makes it clear that much of the marble coldness of Hester's impression was to be attributed to the circumstances that her life had turned in a great measure from passion and feeling to thought. In her routine conduct, Hester remains a conformist to the tenets of Puritanism in colonial New England. It is at the level of speculation and critical thinking that she tends to become subversive and challenges the patriarchal basis of man-woman relationship in mid-17th century Boston. As a first step, the whole system of society is to be turned down and built up anew. Then the very nature of opposite sex, or its long hereditary habit, which has become like nature, is to be essentially modified before woman can be allowed to assume what seems a fair and suitable position. What the narrator is suggesting, commenting on Hester's radicalism, is that before women can really be empowered, there has to be a drastic and radical change in their consciousness and mental makeup. Without such a radical transformation in female psyche, the complete recasting of man-woman relationship will not take place. There will be no end their suffering and persecution in the existing society. One can sum up Hester's complex radical character through the words of David Levin. No English or American novelist before him had been able to represent convincingly the feelings and thoughts of passionate women, and scarcely any American novelist had posed such forceful and critical questions for prevailing 19th century beliefs. The American novel Ed by Wells Stegner, page 24. Hawthorne is supposed to be Janus faced, that is, he looks both towards the past and the future. It is through Hester that the past and future are disastrously woven in the text. There is no wonder that a recent critic like Charles Swan has described the text as future-oriented history. There is no other character in the Scarlet Letter who is better embodiment of the future-oriented history. That is one who can be a bridge between the past and the future. It is through an appreciation of the vast range of Hester's conduct and radical thought that one can adequately evaluate the Scarlet Letter as a work of fiction, illuminating both the past and the future. Then Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale is represented priest in a colonial Boston. He has come to the new world with the learning and sophistication of the old world. It is, however, his misfortune that he is trapped into adultery with a married woman of his parish. Since he is a man of high status, he is very much aware of the moral responsibility. As a pastor, he is responsible for the moral uplift of men and women in his church. There is no other character in the Scarlet Letter who has such a dominant superego. When Hester stands on the scaffold and makes a public confession of her sin, Dimmesdale also has an acute awareness of his guilt. Okay, so he is product of the Puritan ethos that dominates New England, and as such he cannot think either in terms of returning to the old world or escaping into American wilderness. It is also difficult for him to confess his guilt in the public because he is afraid of losing his status and good name. He admires the courage and strength of Hester, but his intense preoccupation with the social role prevents him from doing what she does on the scaffold. He has a divided self. He is aware of Hester's sexual attractiveness. But he does not have the courage to own her publicly. There is no wonder that he has a habit of putting his hand over his hat. This gesture is an index of the protracted conflict in Dimmesdale's mind. Paul repeatedly asks her mother why the priest always puts his hand over his hat. This gesture is an index of the protracted conflict in the Dimmesdale mind. Paul repeatedly asks her mother why the priest always puts his hand over his hat. It's Dimmesdale divided self and agonizing mental conflict that leads to the weakening of his body and mind. The fact of Chillingworth staying with him and keeping constant vigil on his psyche adds manifold to his woes. He is driven to such a desperation that he begins to fast, inflict harsh punishment on his body, and confesses his sin in such a manner in the parish that the listeners look upon his theatrical confession as a sign of his virtue and probity. The more the priest tortures himself, the more he realizes that he is a hypocrite in the eye of God. The more the priest tortures himself, the more he realizes that he is a hypocrite in the eye of God. So here is the main key point. You can note down in your notebook. The more the priest tortures himself, the more he realizes that he is a hypocrite in the eye of God. The narrator's comment, okay, so the narrator comment is significant. He thus typified the constant introspection, but he could not purify himself. It has also to be noted that the fasting, penance and self-torture are not in conformity with the tenets of Puritanism. It has also to be noted that the fasting, penance and self-torture are not in conformity with the tenets of Puritanism. The narrator's comment on the Dimmesdale's behavior is revealing indeed. His inward trouble drove him to practices more in accordance with the old corrupted faith of Rome than with the better light of the church in which he had been born and bred. The narrator's comment on Dimmesdale's behavior is revealing indeed. Okay, so the narrator's comment on Dimmesdale's behavior is revealing indeed. His inward trouble drove him to practices more in accordance with the old corrupted faith of Rome than with the better light of the church in which he had born and bred. Whether we evaluate the priest from a secular point of view, from the point of view of a mid-17th century Puritan, he appears before us as a moral hypocrite and a betrayer of love and family responsibility. There is no wonder that the priest has a terrible consciousness of being a non-entity, both in human and also within a theological framework. There is no wonder that the priest has a terrible consciousness of being non-entity, both in human and also within a theological framework. The narrator has expressed poignantly the dilemma of the Dimmesdale. To the untrue man, the whole universe is false, it is impalpable, it shrinks to nothing within his grasp, and he himself, in so far as he shows himself in a false light, becomes a shadow, or indeed ceases to exist. It is in the state of mind that Dimmesdale sees the letter A in the sky. There is a flash of meteors during his midnight journey to the scaffold. The narrator makes it clear that of meteors during his midnight, makes it clear that the letter A is simply a creation of Dimmesdale's morbid imagination and is also a projection of his guilt. When he lets out a wild shriek, he has a fear that the entire town of Boston would come to the scaffold and see him with the Hester and Pearl. It is clear that the priest's fear of social disgrace is far more powerful than his conscience, which prompts him to mount the scaffold and publicly own Hester and Pearl. It is clear that priest's fear of social disgrace is far more powerful than his conscience, which prompts him to mount the scaffold and publicly own Hester and Pearl. Since he occupies a distinguished position in the community, it becomes difficult for him to confess his guilt. Since he occupies a distinguished position in the community, it becomes difficult for him to confess his guilt. It is Chillingworth, the antagonist, who holds his hand and takes him away from the scaffold. It is Chillingworth, the antagonist, who holds his hand and takes him away from the scaffold. Hester and Pearl, scaffold to see him, Hester and Pearl. It is clear that priest's fear of social disgrace is far more powerful than his conscience, who occupies a distinguished position in the community. It becomes difficult for him to confess his guilt. It is Chillingworth and the antagonist who holds his hand and takes him away from the scaffold. The narrator's comment on his scene is significant indeed. With a chill despondency like an awakening, all nerveless from an ugly dream, he yields himself to the physician and was led away. It is significant that Chillingworth is the man who takes Dimmesdale away from the scaffold, where he is united with Hester and Pearl. For a brief moment, the priest does not have the strength to extricate himself from the grip of his antagonist. Dimmesdale has later on a meeting with Hester and Pearl in the forest. It is in its idyllic atmosphere that he agrees to elope with her to the old world. There is a momentary burst of energy within him, and he writes the election sermon to be delivered on the day the new governor is to take over. The election sermon is a huge success, but the priest's triumph is momentary. He is eventually united with Hester and Pearl and dies on the scaffold. Before his death, the priest, however, makes a prophecy. In the words of the narrator, it was his mission to foretell a high and glorious destiny for the newly gathered people of the Lord. While at the personal level, Dimmesdale is full of premonition of death, He does not fail to forecast a glorious destiny for the Puritan Republic in New England. The past and the future are the ultimate analysis, as closely entwined in Dimmesdale as they are in Hester. They know that they will not live to see the future materialize in their lifetime, but it would materialize one day. There is a transcendentalist hope of a utopia being eventually realized on the earth, both for Hester and Dimmesdale. It is their sin that unites them and their hope as well. Then Chillingworth. We have to told you that the Scarlet Letter not only a historical romance but a psychological romance as well. Chillingworth, the cuckold husband, is a fine study of a man degenerating due to an obsession. His obsession to find out the man who has committed adultery with his wife. When Hester refuses to name her lover in the fast scaffold scene, Chillingworth says with vehemence, "But he will be known. He will be known. He will be known." As a physician, he is given to the collection of herbs and medicines. He does admit that as an old man, he was unwise to marry a young, beautiful woman. There is a touch of regret in his words to Hester. "It was my folly and thy weakness. A man of thought, the bookworm of great libraries, a man already in decay, having given my best years to feed the hungry dream of knowledge. What had I to do with youth and beauty like thine own?" It has to be noted that Hester is equally forthright in her reply to her husband. Thou knowest that I was frank with thee. I felt no love, nor friend any. Later on, Hester urges Chillingworth to cast her off at once as an adulterous wife. Chillingworth is, however, too deeply hurt and humiliated by her lover's deed to forgive him. He acts as a typical husband in a male-dominated patriarchal society, and he does not want to be publicly reviled as a cuckolded husband. What becomes the goal of his life is to hunt the man who has sullied his honor as a husband. When Hester refuses to reveal the name of her paramour, Chillingworth is obsessed with the idea of hunting the man and punishing him. It is the fourth chapter of the tale that there is a crucial exchange between Hester and her husband. "Why dost thou smile so at me?" inquired Hester, troubled at the expression of his eyes. "Art thou like the black man that haunts the forest round about us? Dost thou enticed me into a bond that will prove the ruin of my soul?" Not thy soul," he answered with another smile. "No, not thine." It is from the point onwards the Chillingworth ceases to be human and becomes an allegorical character. Hester wonders if her husband is the black man of the forest who traps man's soul into evil and leads him to damnation. The word leech that is used by the narrator to describe the physician is most appropriate. He clings to the priest like a leech, sucks his blood, and gets a devilish pleasure when he sees the mysterious mark on the chest. He clings to the priest like a leech, sucks his blood, and gets a devilish pleasure when he sees the mysterious mark on his chest. When Hester urges him to forget and forgive and leave punishment to God, Chillingworth tells her sternly, "I have no such power as thou tellest me. My old faith, long forgotten, comes back to me and explains all that we do and always suffer. It is our fate. Let the black flower blossom as it may." The old faith mentioned by Chillingworth perhaps therefore refers to the Old Testament, according to which the evildoer must be punished. Retribution is the spirit that guides the physician, and the New Testament spirit of forgiveness is alien to his makeup. Chillingworth is present in all the three scenes near the scaffold. In the first scaffold scene, he is a stranger standing near an Indian. In the second scaffold scene, he appears suddenly and leads Dimmesdale away. In the third and last scaffold scene, he is utterly humiliated and lost when the priest mounts the scaffold and publicly confesses his sin. His last spoken words are an index of his utter failure. "Thou hast escaped me." His life has been utter failure. As he himself foreshadows it, the black flower has blossomed and ruined him as a husband and also as a physician. Instead of healing others, he injures them and also injures his own soul irreparably. The phrase black flower stands for evil and sums up Chillingworth's life and destiny. The phrase black flower stands for evil and sums up Chillingworth's life and destiny. Of all the major characters in the Scarlet Letter, he is the only character who has a past but has no future. Before he dies unnoticed, he does bestow his property on Paul, but it is too small a deed to redeem his soul. Then come to Paul. Paul is a lovely, mischievous and naughty young child. She is a creature of impulse and is not amenable to rules. The narrator describes her as a lovely and immortal flower out of the rank luxuriance of a guilty passion. When Hester retires to the solitary cottage, Paul is her only companion. She finds her daughter so wild and impulsive that she wonders whether Paul is a human child. There is no peer group to socialize Paul, and she grows into a willful, obdurate young girl. Most of the time she plays alone, and she is not much bothered by the hostility of the little Puritans in and around Boston. The narrator describes the Hester's solitary daughter in these words: Paul was a born outcast of the infinite world. As Paul grows up wild and willful, Hester is disturbed by her mischievousness. There is also rumors floating in the community that Paul is a demon offspring. Paul's obsession with the Scarlet Letter on her mother's bosom also disturbs Hester and creates a sort of ambiguity in her response to her daughter. She loves Paul and also dreads her inquisitiveness reflected on her bold, penetrating eyes. The narrator has described Hester's anxiety in these words: it was as if an evil spirit possessed the child and had just peeped forth in mockery. It is the sign in the governor's house that Paul's worth as a human being is fully reflected. When Reverend Wilson, the most venerable clergyman, asks Paul if she is a Christian child, Paul replies frankly, I am mother's child and my name is Paul. The governor also asks Hester if she will be able to bring up Paul properly. Hester's goal of life as a single parent is vividly expressed by the narrator. I can teach my little Paul what I have learned from this, answered Hester, preening, laying her finger on the red token. The narrator makes it clear that even a fallen woman like Hester has rights and mother's rights to be precise. There is no wonder that Hester's right as a mother is fully vindicated by Arthur Dimmesdale, and both the civil and the religious authority abandon their plan of separating Paul from Hester. The narrator makes a pertinent point at the end of the scene in the governor's house. Even thus, early had the child saved her from certain snares. It is clear that the responsibility of bringing up Paul as a single parent gives a sense of purpose to Hester. It is in this sense that Paul saves her from the temptation of devil. In the forest scene also, when Hester throws the Scarlet Letter away, it is Paul who urges her to put the Scarlet Letter back on her bosom. Hester's daughter reminds her mother that the Scarlet Letter cannot be discarded. It is inseparable from her destiny. Paul plays a very crucial role in the forest scene, and but for her insistence, Hester would have forgotten her badge of shame and her cross. In the last scaffold scene, also Paul kisses Dimmesdale and plays a key role in the reunion of the father and mother in the market. She sheds tears as she kisses her father. The narrators comment on Paul's tears in revealing indeed they were the place that she would grow up amid human joy and sorrow, nor forever do battle with the world but be a woman in it. As an infant and as a young girl, Paul plays an important role in the unfolding of the narrative. She is both a symbol of beauty and stern reminder of her mother's sin. It is not only Hester but Dimmesdale as well who feels uncomfortable in her presence. As a young woman, however, Paul becomes the archetypal American young woman who is blessed by a fortune and also marries a noble of the old world. While Hester returns to New England, Paul goes back to the old world. Her childhood is an integral part of the moral and spiritual drama unfolded in the Scarlet Letter, but her youth and marriage remind us of the happy ending associated with the fairy tales. It is also a glimpse of poetic justice and operates marginally in the dark, brooding world of mid-17th century New England. Paul is the only ray of hope in the world governed by Roger Chillingworth and Mistress Havens. Then come to minor characters. Okay. Then come to minor characters. Then here we have already told you that minor characters are products of history and locate the drama of sin and redemption in a specific time and place. Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham and Mistress Evans are among the significant minor characters. Both Reverend Wilson and Governor Bellingham also represent the first scaffold scene. It is Reverend Wilson, the eldest clergyman in the Boston, who urges Hester to name her lover. Later on, he requests Arthur Dimmesdale to put pressure on Hester to confess her sin and declare the name of her partner in the scene of adultery. When Dimmesdale's effort did not bear fruit, Reverend Wilson delivers a sermon admonishing unrepentant sinners. He warns both Hester and the community present near the scaffold of the danger of being trapped by the devil. It has, however, no effect on Hester, who, after her ordeal before the scaffold, goes back to the prison. The narrator draws our attention to the folk belief in the mid-17th century New England. It was whispered by those who preferred after her that the Scarlet Letter threw a lurid gleam among the dark passageway of the interior. In the scene of the governor's house, we find the Governor Bellingham and Reverend Wilson are together, and is Reverend Wilson who is given the chance to interrogate Hester and Paul. In the scene of the governor's house, we find that Governor Bellingham and Reverend Wilson are together, and is Reverend Wilson who is given the chance to interrogate Hester and Paul. It is clear that the head of the church and the head of the state work together, and as far as Hester's concern is concerned, it is Reverend Wilson who is entrusted with the sole responsibility of chastening Hester and her unruly child. Okay. So, head of the state work together, and as far as Hester's concern is concerned, it is Reverend Wilson who is entrusted with the sole responsibility of chastening Hester and her unruly child. One can conclude that the state in New England was a kind of theocracy, and there is no separation of civil authority and religious authority. Following the lead by Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham, who wants to know if Hester would be able to bring up her child as a sober, disciplined Puritan. He also urges Reverend Wilson to find out if Paul is being brought up in a proper religious atmosphere. It is clear that Reverend Wilson and Governor Bellingham work with perfect understanding. It was also to be noted that the Dimmesdale defends Hester's right as a mother. Both Reverend Wilson and Governor Bellingham show an open mind, and in spite of the reservation about Hester, agree to give a trial to Dimmesdale's suggestion to let Hester bring up Paul. Mistress Evans is a witch lady who is supposed to be an agent and emissary of devil. There is a conversation between Hester and Mistress Evans at the end of the scene in Governor's house, and she urges her to come to the forest and sign a pact of the devil. Hester, however, does not fail in the trap set by Mistress Evans. The witch lady is also present in the governor's house during the second scaffold scene. When Dimmesdale strikes at midnight, he feels that the whole town will awake and find him with Hester and Paul. The narrator has made it clear the town did not awake, or if it did, the drowsy slumberers mistook the cry either for something frightful in a dream or for the noisy of the witches, whose voices at that period were often heard to pass over the settlements or lonely cottages as they rode the Satan through the air. It is clear that Mr. Evans is not only an allegorical character but also product of the folk imagination in colonial New England. There is no doubt that Mr. Evans is an authentic product of the folk belief in the mid-17th century New England. There is a touch of legend about Mr. Evans, who is definitely a throwback to the remote past. She belongs to a past that is dark, mysterious and irrational. Then let us sum up. Chillingworth represents science, Hester art, Dimmesdale religion and Paul nature. Paul, Hester, Dimmesdale also foreshadow id, ego and superego. Hester and Chillingworth stands for Eros and Thanatos. Hester, Dimmesdale, Pearl, Chillingworth are major characters, and Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham, Mistress Evans constitute minor characters. While the major characters are multidimensional and undergo subtle transformation, and the minor characters are rather flat and one-dimensional. While the major characters act and interact to create a moving drama of sin and redemption, and the minor characters locate the tale in mid-17th century in New England. While the major characters act and interact to create a moving drama of sin and redemption, and the minor characters locate the tale in mid-17th century New England. The characters have been developed largely through allegory and symbols. They are far from realistic. The characters have been developed largely through allegory and symbols. They are far from realistic. Okay. Then come to the questions. While the Hester is the unpenitent sinner, Dimmesdale is the half-repentant sinner, Chillingworth the unrepentant sinner. It is fair. Is it a fair assessment of the three major characters in the Scarlet Letter? Then question number 2. Do you agree with the view that Paul saves Hester from the temptation of the devil? Compare and contrast Reverend Wilson and Governor Bellingham. It is remarkable that persons who speculate most boldly often conform with the most perfect quietude to the external regulation of society. The Scarlet Letter examine the ups and downs of Hester in the light of the statement quoted above. Write a note on Mistress Evans, the witch lady. Bring out the importance of the minor characters in the Scarlet Letter. How are they related to the major characters? Why does Paul migrate to the old world? Why does Hester return to her cottage in New England? Let the black flower blossom as it may. The Scarlet Letter examine the ups and downs of Roger Chillingworth in the light of the statement cited. Her hath proved his mercy most of all in my applications. The Scarlet Letter make an assessment of Dimmesdale in the light of statement cited. How are the past and the future entwined both in Hester and Dimmesdale? Why is Hester compared to a non-conformist like Annie Hutchinson? Is it appropriate to describe her as a radical woman? Then suggested reading. Okay. So, thank you viewers for like, share and subscribe my channel, and keep watching the video till end, and you will get more notification and get more key points on the video of the Scarlet Letter of MEG 6. Thank you viewers.